Yeah, a company our size, the fact that I was, two levels down from the owner of all 13 of these companies, you'd go, well, obviously, you know all kinds of things. And I do know a handful of things. But, in cases like that, I read about it on the internet the same time most of you did.
Hey everybody, it's Comic Industry Insiders, your weekly look at the comic book industry and talking to the people behind the scenes who make everything happen. This week we're going to do a rebroadcast. A couple weeks ago we had on our live show, which is not surprisingly called Comic Industry Insiders Live, a man named Chris Powell. Chris was the VP of a lot of different things over at Diamond Comics Distribution during its bankruptcy and during those final days. And he was very kind in coming on our show and giving us the lowdown on what that felt like on the inside. Also gave us insight into what everyone should be thinking about as we all start to process what this new reality in our new industry looks like. Chris Powell is a good friend of mine, and I'm so grateful that he came on the show and looking forward to what he does next. If you are watching this for the first time or listening to this for the first time, can I recommend that you hit like, subscribe, and alert on YouTube, because we do go live every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we talk to a lot of these folks and, answer a lot of the questions that you might have. So do feel free to check that out. All right. Now, today on the show, we're joined by one of the most respected names in the comic book distribution and retail, Chris Powell. With decades of experience in the direct market, Chris is best known for his long tenure with Diamond Comics Distributors, where he just served as the Executive Director of Business Development, later as VP of Retailer Services, and finally as Chief Relationship Officer for Jeppy Family Enterprises, the parent company of Diamond Comics Distributors, Alliance Game Distributors, Diamond Book Distributors, Hakes Auctions, and Diamond Select Toys, along with a bunch of other pop culture related companies. Before that, he helped shape the retail landscape as the longtime general manager of Lone Star Comics, also known as My Comic Shop, then a pioneering chain in Texas and still market leader in online comic sales. Chris has been a vocal advocate for comic shops, a key player in industry initiatives like Free Comic Book Day, and a steady presence during some of the most turbulent shifts in the comics distribution model. We're going to talk a lot about that today. Beyond distribution, he currently serves as the current vice president and former president on the board of directors of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, working to protect the First Amendment rights of comic book creators, retailers, and readers. Chris is also one of the founding board members of Comics Pro, and his influence can still be felt there today. He also really likes tiki bars. Friends and neighbors, my good friend and the third nicest guy in comics, Mr. Chris Powell. Chris, how are you, buddy?
Hello. Good. Oh, I'm sorry. Howdy. Since you said that just for me.
That's right. Well, we both are from the same general metroplex of Texas, right? And we both now live really horrible Yankee lives. And so I feel like, there's a connection there. You know what I'm saying?
Maryland, we are still not Yankees, so.
Oh, come on. If you were in Texas, you would not be saying that. Anybody north of the, I don't know. I think north of Texas is a Yankee.
So, as long as you can see it, you're kind of a Yankee. It's fine.
How are you doing, my friend? You just recently got some time, some personal time. Like you're getting to use up all that PT now.
Yeah, right? I decided that the cats needed somebody to keep them company all day. So about the middle of May, something happened. I don't remember what it was, and then I found myself with some free time. So here we are.
Yeah, here we are. We get to talk. At some point, I would love to do one of our sort of long form interviews where I get to know, all aspects of your career. and get to explore some of the stuff that you and I have talked over Mai Tais about. Not all of it, though. Most of it we should,
right. Just the public consumption stuff.
Yes, right, exactly. But for today's conversation, we really kind of wanted to focus in on the Diamond Comics distribution bankruptcy and sort of how that narrative played out for you behind the scenes. Before we get into that, can you give me the 90-second, who is Chris Powell? What are why should you hire him, and what will you be getting? Because, you could be talking to your future employer right now. So,
yeah, I haven't decided if I'm going to work for somebody else or work for me yet, but I've been taking some pretty interesting calls. Anybody who's known me or known of me going back to the mid 90s. My heart is more on the retail side of things than it was in distribution. But when I was trying to decide on a career path, a really good friend of mine said, you can do a lot for retailers in a different place, and tricked me into going to Diamond, which ended up being a lovely 13 years. I did get to do a lot of things I'm very proud of. The teams that I managed, were in charge of point of sale, a lot of the retailer facing procedures and systems, and I manage the customer service teams, and those are the parts of Diamond I'm most proud of anyway, and so I guess it stands to reason since they were mine. But I'll put them up against anybody else's teams that do the same thing any day of the week. And so now I'm interested in how I can keep doing things with retailers and helping them weather some of these challenges that we're all watching happen, and they're living through. Publishers are living through. Some distributors are living through.
No kidding.
So
yeah.
The world is changing again. I was around for the 90s crash, and that was tough. This is one of those again, is the way it kind of feels. We also had COVID in there somewhere. That this industry has been through some real stuff. But the people who are in it are passionate and excited and smart, and those things get them through it. So I really look forward to figuring out and seeing where the industry goes next.
So I wanted to, kind of give some background. You came up through the, as we talked about in the intro, you came up through the My Comic Shop Lone Star system. When you came on with them as a retailer, you were just a youngin', right? You began as a tiny little thing.
Buddy and Judy Saunders, I have sung their praises for 37 years, because there are not a lot of people that would take a 15-year-old, and within 6 months, I had the keys to a store and was managing the day-to-day when I wasn't in junior high and high school. I learned more from them and the people who I worked with there than I possibly could have anywhere else. I started out, part-time sales. My mom had actually worked there first. And I was just in there on the weekends helping her because I liked what she did for a living. And I was bored sitting at home or having to mow the yard. And so I would go help customers when she was busy. And I got a phone call from Judy Saunders, the owner. And we had secret shoppers back in the day that would come and write a report about the store. And they were like, that Chris was really nice in his Dick Tracy t-shirt. And I can't find a Dick Tracy t-shirt in my size now, or I'd be wearing it. Come in tubby dude as easily as the kid in 1990. But Judy asked me if I wanted to do that for money. I thought I was in trouble, and she offered me my first job. And, after years of managing individual stores and sometimes like 2 stores at a time, I took over as general manager and, had people like Aaron Settle, who's still at Urban Legends in Mesquite, Texas, worked with me as a regional manager, and we supervised all 8 stores, and we started a mail order business in that time that has grown exponentially. Like, I go and visit the warehouse now and nobody would believe it if you haven't walked through it. We started out with not such auspicious beginnings, but it worked out.
I was talking to Conan early, not too long ago, and we were discussing, the size and breadth of those warehouses. And I said the last time I'd been in them, you gave me a tour because you were still working there. So it has been a minute. I can only imagine. And your mom owns one or two of those stores that
Yeah.
you originally were the Lone Star chain.
Yeah, one of the reasons that I left Lone Star is they had decided to focus on the e-commerce business, and my passion was people that I would actually see and talk to, as opposed to people who are buying online, and they had Conan and some other people who were going to handle that business. So mom and my dad ended up buying the last two of the stores after we sold the others to, like the Collected in that area is Brent Irwin from Wizard Magazine and a bunch of other things. Aaron Settle that I mentioned. And then my mom has Fort Worth and Arlington. And so I still get to, sort of hear the retailer point of view 4 times a day. Whether I want to or not, no, that's not true. If she logs in, I'll be in trouble, but that's all right.
Hi, Mom. Well, I do hope she's doing well. I know, we're hearing from a lot of comics retailers that right now, despite all of the anxiety and drama behind the scenes, that comic sales themselves are actually doing really incredibly well. So I hope she's doing real well. I hope to see you next time I go home to see my mom.
There you go.
So let's dig into Diamond. And I wanted to go quickly through the timeline, but before we get into the timeline and what you kind of saw behind the scenes, I guess my biggest question is, they had essentially, 27-year monopoly on distribution inside of the comics industry. They were during that time an incredibly stable period. Comic shops grew incrementally, but like it was one of the I would say one of the bright spots in all of brick and mortar retail is how well comic shops did during that tenure of monopoly, right? Of just the stability of the comic shops being open and staying open. I guess my question is, the 27-year monopoly, what went wrong? How do you lose that?
I think that, well, the how do you lose it is, there were people who were not happy with only having a single place to buy. They made that very clear to different publishers. Those publishers then went and opened other avenues, and that alone could probably have been weathered. Just because of the way things work, is if you still have access to everything and are the easiest place to buy, then a lot of people will keep buying from you. It's okay to have competition. Competition overall is a good thing. The challenge that we have as an industry, I think, is how many distributors can we support with the current number of retailers, the volume, the number of comics that sell. Like, people all the time are like, well, if a comic book is on the shelves, it obviously sold 25,000 copies. It's not the case. We wish it was. But Diamond, in that 27 years, and I was there for 13 of them, so they were very well established when I got there. The reason that I was approached was to do new things for retailers. They had seen the success way back of Carol Kalish and the cash register program, because before that, retailers sometimes just had a cash box, and they wanted the next version of that, which was to get widespread adoption of point of sale. And we had to work with publishers on different programs to make that happen. And all of these things are a massive investment, as many other people know today, because they're doing it separate from Diamond. But back then it was a larger investment because programmers and computers and a lot of that stuff were just more pricey back then. But we saw ourselves, and this came directly from Steve Jeppy, as, sort of patrons of the retailers. Like, we were trying to provide an environment where they could succeed most easily. And I feel like we were good at that. in a lot of ways. The challenge over the years, though, is as costs rise. So when we were in the kind of relationship that we were with publishers, in a lot of cases, the publishers set the price. And that's fine. That's their right. But that affects directly how much Diamond was having to put in the bank. And when things like, contracts that have been long standing don't include, hey, it's been 10 years, maybe we should get more money. You're trying to get by on less. And our challenge was always that we didn't want to lower the level of service when we could help it. I'm not going to say we never had to, but the core services, whether it was point of sale, providing data files, putting out Previews magazine, having daily updates that had to be written and edited and put into a system by somebody, all of that stuff continued through my last day, the 16th of May. And a ton of people have kept at it since then and continue to do a lot of that work, but not all of it. And that's what we're starting to see some of the effects of, but that's where Diamond, really ran into challenges, was if you don't have, better profit margins to cover when, costs at the warehouse tripled over the space of like 4 years. Whether it was increases in minimum wage or, utilities going up or a combination of those and insurance, our incoming money did not triple. So, that at the end of the day, we brought in 2 different groups of people. I say we, while I was only, 2 levels down from Steve Jeppe, these things just sort of showed up one day because it was handled by Steve. And, some of his consultants, they brought in people to try to help us restructure and find a way to continue providing the same level of service. But we needed to find ways to bring in more money. But at the same time, I could easily have changed discounts on certain things or added fees or any number of things. But at the end of the day, that would hurt retailers, and that would go counter to everything that we tried to do every day. If we had a retailer call and say, I'm trying to go, I'm going out of business, we would pull out the stops. One of the big challenges was after COVID and even before, Diamond carried a lot of retailer debt, some publisher debt. Those are just the kinds of things that happened in a single distributor environment, because if somebody owed us money and couldn't pay it, I had 2 choices. One was to extend them additional credit and hope they could pull through. And sometimes that meant, I had people who were on I'm sure they loved it, a weekly phone call with me to get updates on the business and me to decide on a weekly basis if we were going to continue sending them product. Because if I cut them off, I am closing a store instantly. In the current environment, you may owe somebody money, stop buying from them and go to somebody else. But because the distributors now know that, they're not all issuing the same kind of terms that we did, or you're just going to run through 2 or 3 distributors and you're going to run out of places to go. And so I don't know, that we won't see at some point that catch up to a handful of retailers, or maybe more than a handful, because we went into bankruptcy with them still owing us money. But at the end of the day, we still maintained a level of stores for, the last 10 years, the number of stores was relatively stable, varying 1% or 2% a year, because we're always bringing in new business. We had an account team that was specifically for looking for new retailers. And that's one of the things I'm not seeing from anybody right now, is I think getting new retailers is one of the biggest challenges, because current retailers know what they're doing and they, have learned a lot, whether it was working with us or figuring it out with Comics Pro and other retailers. New retailers coming in are not going to have some of that experience, and I worry about that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that support structure that you were able to provide is going to be very difficult to replace. I know that there are many of us that are talking behind the scenes about, third party kind of solutions for some of these things, but all of those are going to be expensive and difficult, and we'll not be able to do it at a loss like you guys were able to. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops, as we enter this, post diamond world. I want to get into more of that, but before we do, I'd love to get into sort of the narrative here. Before we go into kind of what the bankruptcy itself, let's go back to, obviously this begins during COVID. We've covered this a lot, both on the podcast and on this show, about where some of these things happened because of COVID. The disruption in distribution began to take place. But I'd like to get into, you look back on this now, at some point you lose DC, and that seems to, or not, yeah, you lose DC to Lunar and to Midtown. I can't remember what their distributor name was, UCBS, something like that. Anyway, doesn't matter. You lose them, and then at some point it's obvious that we're on a train, right? We're on a path, and that path is going somewhere in particular. Is there when you look back on that, how would you handle that differently? How the reaction of your company versus, I mean, I'm not saying you personally, but how do you think Diamond should have handled that change, that shift in the company plan?
I think that some of the ideas were the right ones, but didn't work out, and so, I mean, some of it is like minor tweaks to how you affect something, because periodicals were a challenge from the get-go. Periodicals are just the toughest thing in comic distribution. Trade paperbacks, they're like books. They're easy. You go pick one off the shelf, you're probably getting, $3 or $4 for that. When you go pick a comic off the shelf, you might be getting 20 cents. So, some of the ideas and this wasn't just me, we would sit in some big meetings and pitch things, was, do we have a minimum quantity when you want to do a reorder of a single SKU? Things that they would be less retailer friendly, but hopefully tenable and generate profit. But coming to consensus on those and, talking to some retailers, they were very unpopular. One of the biggest issues at Diamond for years was freight. And, the problem is, when you are a distributor, you are charged a certain amount for freight, and then you get rebates based on your volume. And we were not able to pass as much of the rebates back as distributors who were providing fewer services. So the answer, and it's difficult, because if I could do it now, I would, wave a magic wand and get one of the 3 or 4 POS makers to be further along than they were at the time, and be able to sort of say, we're going to wind this down and pass people over there.
Right.
But all of those cost exponentially more than what we were doing. And we were hearing from retailers, we can't afford more than we're paying now. They all start anywhere from $200 to $400 a month. And that doesn't sound like a lot to a consumer necessarily, but retailers know that's a chunk, it's a lot of money. And so, I think that pivoting on freight sooner might have helped. But the problem was, there genuinely just wasn't the margin there to pay for that and be able to continue providing what we viewed as essential services. So once the volume started leaving, I hate to say it was going to happen, but I think short of some kind of seismic shift or, me winning the lottery and dumping the money into Diamond, this was kind of going to happen. COVID, we saw it happen to, many businesses. So I don't feel like Diamond is alone in it. We're just alone in this industry, that, the choices we had to make, the credit we had to extend, any number of things that had to be done to keep the industry going long enough to move to other distributors. We just shut things up, at any point, and that wouldn't have been a good solution either. We kept almost every retail store alive through that process. And, Steve may have lost the business in the process, but did it doing what he thought was the right thing to do.
And that maybe in the end of the day is going to be the legacy, right? Is that kept so many of those stores open through that period where, like I said, brick and mortar have seen just a almost complete die off. You go through any strip mall and it's all service oriented storefronts now, where it used to be lots of different kinds of brick and mortar. And the fact that comic shops have not gone up or down, I think it's 4% in something like 20 years for the store count. Like, that's incredible. It's incredible. So
yeah, and it's we had one of the consultants come in, and in a somewhat heated discussion about what we were going to do on something. I can't even remember specifically what. He said, well, I don't understand why you care so much. You're thinking too hard about these retailers. And I said, well, two things. One, that's my job. Two, everybody I know makes their money from this building in one way or another. Whether it is, I know comic creators, we sell their stuff, they get paid. Publishers, same thing. Retailers, same thing. It's just one of those things where, of course, we cared. Most of us, you had Nance Romer, who, made my department work. If you ever need the smart person, you go to Nance. If you need, this, you go to me. She was one of the people who almost killed herself, during COVID, because she was on the phone with stores every day, helping them figure out how to navigate that stuff. So, it's just the cost of doing business, and nothing lasts forever. I hate that that's the case. In our case, I just don't know that these changes that we're going through now weren't inevitable, and I hope they're in the long-term good.
I think so. I mean, and also, we're seeing like Nance is now going to be hopefully doing some of that same work for Universal Distribution as they enter into this field. I think it was incredibly smart of them to pick her and our good buddy Tim Lanahan both up to get this ball rolling. But speaking of Universal Distribution, I had heard some scuttlebutt about them discussing purchasing Diamond well before that bankruptcy procedure happened. Were you at any part of that? And maybe this is a good point where you can talk about what it's like to be on the inside of a company like this that is going through this kind of transition and going through bankruptcy.
Yeah, a company our size, the fact that I was, two levels down from the owner of all 13 of these companies, you'd go, well, obviously, all kinds of things. And I do know a handful of things. But, in cases like that, I read about it on the internet the same time most of you did. It was not something that happened outside of maybe 3 or 4 people, one level up from me, because we knew that we were struggling. That's evident. The executives took a 30% pay cut at the beginning of COVID. What are we now, like 6-7 years later? We never got it back. So this was not something that, snuck up on us all of a sudden. Brought in the consultants. They proposed changes. We tried different things. One of the things that's a little bit invisible to people is, when you went through my obscenely long list of titles, when I moved to the Jeppy Family Enterprises, that's a group of 13 different pop culture companies, 9 of which most people have never heard of. And a lot of them were startups and were trying to do new things, which meant we were funding them. And so that kind of stuff, we had to figure out ways to make them make money so we didn't have to give them any. But at the end of the day, I got notice maybe 3 days before the world did that the consultants and the bank had decided we were going to file bankruptcy. Was not my favorite day. It's,
I can only imagine.
Well, because I'm an optimist, little Mary Sunshine, as Bob Wayne likes to refer to it. I thought I really thought there was a path forward that was going to work, but I knew it was going to be hard. And the bank, which is going to come into play, just, sometimes they run out of patience. We were living on a line of credit. That's the way businesses our size frequently work. And the people who had issued that line of credit were like, yeah, we think we'd like to not be doing that anymore. So when they declared bankruptcy, and everybody has seen the names of some people you had never seen before, whether it's Rob Gorin or some of these other names that are now frequently on comics press websites and probably on your show more often than not. They took over, like they came in and said, we're in charge now. And a lot of us went into like maintenance mode, where I kept things going on the retailer services side, and I would just get a phone call that said, you need to cut X number of people. We don't care, and just do it. And so we had to make some hard decisions there. And then all that work, again, we still didn't cut services, and all of that is a tribute to the people that our retailers talk to every day, because all of them got more work and no more money and still got the job done every day. I love the team that I supervised and what they did, but we were all in the dark. I hate, admitting that I got my news the same time, sometimes later because I slept in, as all of you did. I would log in every evening, and there's an online court docket where you can follow all of these things. And I'm now a, borderline legal expert because I read them every day and I understand every word. They're really incredibly complicated and weird, but I would just read that, and that's the only way I would know what was going on. And when we got to the auction, we all just sat by the computer waiting to see who won the auction. There was drama after the auction that I still do not honestly understand. I'm not one that frequently goes around going, oh, but I read that stuff and it mystifies me, and now we're at another round of decisions I don't understand with the consignment product and all of this. I'm on the outside looking in, and I know how much I hate it because I know who it affects and how, but I just don't know how we got here. And I think that largely it's because the decisions were no longer being made by anybody whose names that you've met, that you'll ever meet. They were purely, banks saying we're going to get our money one way or another. And that's where we have ended up is, it is being, they just sold one of the businesses today that had gone in the auction to Ad Populum. They sold CGA today, which was one of our most recent, was one of our baby companies that we had only bought 3 years ago or something like that. And so I don't know if that's the plan for the rest of the stuff they bought. I have no idea. I have never spoken to anybody from Ad Populum. That is a, burr in my saddle. We got bought on the 16th. I got an email late in the day on the 16th, never having spoken to anybody, that said, we don't need you anymore. Have a nice day. And so I spent the end of the day on the 16th writing, some stuff for the POS team to send out once we knew what was going on with Comic Suite, and, leaving Nance and some other people, all the notes I could muster. And on the 17th, I applied for unemployment and became a spectator like the rest of you.
Boy, oh boy. I can only imagine what that must have felt like for you and for many people. I mean, I've spoken to some good friends some of whom are still there, right? And the idea that you're living in this sort of limbo of am I coming into work tomorrow or not? It's just so beyond. I think we were talking before about how managing as many clients as we do is often a challenge, but I know that none of them is going to call me tomorrow and say I'm unemployed. So I can only imagine what that must feel like. I do want to go back to something, speaking of being a spectator. And apologies for the dog that is now barking in the background, but she doesn't realize that we're live. March 25th, actually going back, Alliance Entertainment ends up winning the initial round in March 24th, the initial bid. And in a way that really shocked most of us, because I really thought that Universal was a lock on that. And then on March 25th, Bruce Ogilvie, chairman of Alliance Entertainment, goes on the Beyond Wednesday podcast to discuss the purchase of Diamond, their plans to retain staff, and sets off alarms as he speculates what the value of Alliance Entertainment is to carry low-cost items or even a lower profit intake like comic books. It's all a little bit squishy for him. Trying to figure out how to ask this one. Would you ever in a million years assume that Dennis Barger would have this much involvement in the future of Diamond Comics? Ever?
To be fair, I think that if it wasn't Dennis, that whole thing would have happened somewhere in relatively short order, just based on, what we've seen. I think that they were excited, and I think that they wanted, and none of us, at least, even executives at Diamond didn't know they were going to be bidding in a serious way. It caught me completely by surprise, and I was super excited. I think they're a fantastic company, and was looking very much forward to what I thought they could do, because what I did hear through the grapevine, even after that interview, was that, what Bruce Ogilvie was saying was not we're not going to do this, but it was just, yes, this is a concern we have. They had so many technology solutions and systems in place that might have been able to bring down the cost of handling periodicals. I think there's a real shot that they would have, with some changes, whether it was in cost or things like I talked about earlier, like, you need to order in threes. The comic industry used to order in way more than threes. There were a lot fewer books, but these are not unheard of. They're just far in the past. And, we were trying to provide good service by, I said, if you want to order one, that's fine, but your discount's going to be low, because that's obviously a special order for a customer, guaranteed money for both of us. It may not be as much money. And so it does stink that it didn't work out. And that's really not how I feel. I feel much crummier about it. Every time I see a story about AE&T, I think that a massive opportunity was missed, and I genuinely don't understand how. That couple of week period with all of the crazy back and forth that you saw play out in court dockets and online, we were watching it the same way you were. And I just, my heart just sank as I saw that it was not going to be easy. And eventually it didn't work out. And, I think AE&T, like, they have brought over a lot of our sales and merch team, which were areas they were especially, interested in. And, they are phenomenal for that. Like, every article I read, I'm like, yep, that's how that should have been working. And, at the same time, I'm like, and I know what else we could have done. But I also felt the same way once it was down to, okay, it's going to be Ad Populum. Ad Populum owns a lot of complementary products. And I was like, all right, we keep doing comics, and we can also sell all these other things to retailers in a way that's more affordable than them trying to get them on their own. Ruby's Costumes, Department 56, Anesco are all things that sit really well in a comic book store. And that opportunity, at least isn't there for me. I hope that that's still the direction they're planning to go, because I think that it is what is best for the remaining staff and for the retailers who, are still looking to buy from them if they can right some of the other issues that are going on right now.
Yeah, I hope that is the case. I think my fear is that ad populum, I mean, everything they are doing just seems to be that they're just liquidating. It feels like a sell-off to me. It's unfortunate to see how that is going. Right?
Yeah, man. It's incredibly sad. We're down to, I think, 3 of my former staff are still running customer service over there. And, I'm happy that they're still there, but, cutting down to 3 people doesn't have the appearance of we're going to be doing a robust business in the way that we did in the past.
Yeah, I have no doubt. I think we're all hopeful for that. You've been involved in with the Jeppies and with Chuck Parker, who is that kind of second level down. Can you give us any insight? Because you followed this as even closer, I would imagine, for everybody than for as us. I'm sorry, even closer than even we are following this. How do you feel about this liquidation business that's happening right now, where Diamond is saying they're going to need to liquidate the product they have on consignment? Do you have any insight on how we're getting to this place?
Like, I have read as much as I can as a non-legal expert, and I still don't understand, other than, what I gather is that people who had stuff on consignment, there was a mechanism by which they could say, this is mine, don't touch it, and sort of claw it back, I think is the language some people use. But they didn't know that they needed to do that, and I mean, I'm looking at it from a moral standpoint. I don't get it. I'm just like,
right.
But I also don't think, again, that is a decision being made by anybody we know. I feel like, that is another thing that the bank is just saying, here's what we're going to do, because the bank has a responsibility to its shareholders to get as much of the money they loaned to Diamond back in whatever legal mechanism they can. So if they are right that this is legal, they're going to do it. I hope that the challenges that some publishers are putting forward are successful. I was disappointed that Dynamite didn't even get a hearing on their sort of emergency action last week that I thought was a slam dunk. They would at least get a hearing. So now you know what kind of legal expert I'm not. It's like, I'm pretty good at hiring lawyers, but that's about it. And so I hope that they end up not being able to liquidate that stuff without paying for it. I just, and that's just because I look at this as Diamond was holding most or all of the inventory for a lot of small publishers that, this could kill. And the industry, is already hard enough without some unknown banker making it harder. And that's what this feels like. And I couldn't hate it more. And I also hate it for people I know who are there, because I know they're probably having to hear about this every day. I know I saw a retailer post the other day publicly, I'm not going to be paying my Diamond bills because they're not paying theirs. And I'm sure that, started out as a message to a poor customer service rep who's just happy to get a paycheck every week for not a lot of money. And so we'll see how that shakes out. But I strongly wish that there had been enough of us still there who we'd have probably been unsuccessful. I don't have any misconception that I could win over Chase Bank, but I certainly would have had something to say. And I feel confident that the people who are still there did try. None of the people whose names would do this, period. I can say that knowing everybody from Chuck Parker on down, like this would not have been their choice to do. And, when you have new bosses in the form of the bank, you have to do what you're told, I guess. And, I said the other day on my personal Facebook, I just was thinking about this, and I was like, as much as I wish I had been able to stay on with new owners, if this was going on, I'd have left anyway. I couldn't,
Sure.
in good conscience, hurt this many people, even if it wasn't my choice.
I know that when you did that, I did share my own experience of having worked for a publisher once they were purchased, and I tried sticking it out, but the culture was so different and the values were so different that I realized that I couldn't stay there. So I totally feel where you're coming from. I hope you don't mind. There's somebody, maybe you know this guy's name. Our friend Rich in the chat is asking about, do you have any knowledge about why Diamond chose not to sell to AENT after they won the auction and turned to the backup bidders? Do you have any insight at all into that? I feel like you've already kind of answered this sort of question.
I genuinely don't. I was incredibly disappointed that it went the way that it did, and sort of taken aback. I had started like making lists of things to talk to people about that were exciting, and look at all these other things AENT has that we can offer to retailers and blah blah blah. And then I was confused, because they said it was because we didn't have a WotC contract. We were still taking orders for WotC product. That relationship has never not continued. Alliance has filled every product for WotC from the beginning of the year till now. And so it's just I'm going with weird because it sounds better than shady situation.
I think we're all, the minute the lawyers got involved,
the only time anybody wins in bankruptcy, the only people in bankruptcy who win, I was told this by the bank. They were like, the only people who win are lawyers. And I was like, well, and the bank, let's be fair.
The bank is going to win. The system is set up so the bank wins, right?
JP Morgan didn't think that was nearly as funny as I did, but it's what happens.
I have no doubt.
Yeah, stand-up comedy and banking, not a thing.
For those of you who are in the chat, thank you so much for joining us on this. We wanted to I appreciate Chris stepping up to kind of talk us through this sort of insider. But if you have any questions for us, please do let us know. And honestly, if you haven't already liked, subscribed, and hit the alert button, somewhere Nick Barucci is crying a single tear and is really worried about your immortal soul. I'd love to get into, I feel like, thank you so much for being so transparent about that experience. I'd love to talk just kind of broadly. We have a few minutes left in our broadcast, kind of broadly about what do you think about the future of our industry, and specifically the direct market. Is something you and I have both kind of devoted our careers to. Where do you think we're going? What is the comic shop of the next 10, 15 years? What do they look like? What does a future-proof comic shop look like today?
And for 37 years, I have, to many people's frustration, preached the same thing, was that comics alone is a risky long-term plan. I think that, the store, as rents are going up, payroll is going up, we cannot meet those increases with cover prices and continue to sell periodicals. They're going to have to stay at sort of the commoditized level they are now. So you're going to have to sell other things. And so I think that, going back to stores like yours and mine in the late 90s, early 2000s, where we were some of the first ones carrying toys and statues, and, there were these goofy little green dragons called pocket dragons. I made a ton of money with those. Reed Musgrave, those were the best. That kind of stuff. Being every Lone Star said Lone Star Comics, Games, and Gifts by the time I left. They started out just Lone Star Comics, but then we focused on other areas. And, that's why, 5 of those 8 stores, even though they're under different owners, are still open today, as they're all those hybrid stores. I think there is still a future for comics. I think that trades will continue to get better, and there will always be, depending on where you are, the path to success. Kind of like there's the little mystery bookstore on the corner that's quirky, and people still shop there enough for it to stay open as somebody's passion project. There can be a handful of those stores depending on where you are, but I think broadly stores are going to have to continue diversifying. They are going to have good systems that include potentially online sales. One of my goals, depending on who won the auction, who ended up winning the company, and if I got to still work there, was that, there may not be money in distributing some of the absolute smallest comics that a PRH is going to view as like a vanity book. We didn't view them that way. We viewed them as kind of an incubator path that, eventually could be, Strangers in Paradise. Those first few years, who knew what that was going to be? And it ended up being amazing. And we tried to provide, going all the way back to Bill Shanis, who the few times he had to tighten up minimums, there was just this hue and cry out in the industry, but it was necessary. But he still did it thoughtfully. I wanted to be able to just sell that stuff out of our warehouse direct to a consumer, but do it through a retailer. So we only have to pick it and pack it and ship it. And, the retailer may get a smaller cut, but they still get a cut. And that book still sees distribution in a way that right now it's going to be tough. So, I think that that's one of the things that we lost in, nobody giving this a shot yet.
If you were tomorrow you get an offer you can't refuse to be a publisher of a small press, how are you thinking about distribution now? If you don't already have a distribution deal, and you're a small press publisher, what would you be thinking? How would you be thinking about the direct market?
I like to think that I am altruistic enough that a big part of that decision would be who is doing what for retailers, because, that is going to be who I think is going to be here for the long term. I want to see a consolidated, catalog of some sort, even if it has to be online, which is a distinct possibility, or somebody who, they have the right data structures so that if I am providing data, I think that one of the things we haven't touched on that's important going forward is going to be in a multi-distributor environment is the Comet standard that came out of Comics Pro. People are going to have to make changes to their systems because we need data to be portable from one platform to another. But at the end of the day, I think it has to be a publisher who, if I'm a small print, publisher, or a small press publisher, they need to care about those books and have a plan for how they can successfully distribute them into a lot of stores. I'm not all that interested in an exclusive. I don't think that anybody needs exclusives necessarily. Just because that's been broken up right now, and putting it back together is just going to hurt people again. I think the way to do it now is to, work things out in a way that everybody, publisher reduces their effort if they only have to fill out like one online form that they then send to 2 or 3 distributors, and that populates their system without them having to go, oh wait, this publisher wants it on this date in this really obscure format because their software is old. So it's I think the path forward is what people are working on, with standards and making it easy for a publisher to move around if they need to. I mean, I think that, distributors are going to want contracts, but they may not be able to have what they want, when you're a publisher and you say, look, I want to be able to move when I need to, because if you're not meeting my needs, I don't have 3 years to wait out this contract before I move to somebody else.
Yeah, exclusive contracts. There are plenty of good reasons for them as a publisher, but they're, as you said, they're also every single one of them means you're saying no to something else. It's a real tough decision, and I can see. I absolutely feel for anybody who has to make it.
Well, I do think that, another thing that we need to pay attention to is an aggregator like Massive, because when you have somebody, Rich brought up in the chat, he's right. PRH has a level at which they are willing to distribute books. And that's because every time you're a publisher and you have to deal with a new vendor, the work to deal with the smallest vendor is almost the same amount of work as to deal with the largest, only for a lot less profit.
Right.
And so if you can have a consolidator who, think about Image back in the very early days where they were just a conglomeration of studios. And, I think that putting all of that, putting a lot of product under one umbrella, I can't remember what Massive's calling it. I'm sorry, Massive. But, where they are just going to Lunar and it's one source of billing and marketing and whatever, that I think could be a standalone business of somebody who just does that if they do it successfully.
Yeah, I definitely believe that the future is those aggregators, and I think it's going to be aggregators for data. It's going to be, a single point of contact for multiple publishers with the distributor. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities for people who can, I don't know. I mean, I think the more critics of folks like us who do this kind of stuff, massive indies. That's exactly right. They would say we're middlemen, but the truth of the matter is that you need middlemen. You need people who are able to know where those friction points are and smooth those friction points out. So it is an incredibly useful. And Brian talked about a Comet validator, something that he's working on now, essentially that would allow you to, as you said, submit your data once and have it go in all the multiple different formats. I can definitely see that. I think we have one really important question, and I think it's something that's really on all of our minds for as we go into this summer without really any understanding of what our days are going to look like, and that is we need a non-alcoholic tiki drink that isn't just. I mean, I'm going to say this. Kyle didn't put this in, and Kyle, by the way, hope you're feeling good, buddy. He had to step away from today's show. Personally, the non-alcoholic tiki drinks are always just so sweet for me. Like, how do I begin to think about this, Chris Powell?
Well, non-alcoholic tiki drinks, not my specialty. As you and Dinesh are well aware.
Yes, we are.
No, it's actually one of the most challenging things. So for people that don't know, which is 99% of you, I own a tiki bar in Texas with some friends, and we are right next to a university, and we have a large population of people who don't drink. So, we have a number of custom drinks on the menu that are non-alcoholic for that reason. And I think that, I'm the same as you. I don't like an overly sweet cocktail. I will say that there's a company called Proof that actually does some rums and whatnot that are non-alcoholic that, you can make your traditional tiki drink with, and it'll be non-alcoholic. They're quite tasty. But, they're one of the main ingredients in tiki drinks is an almond extract called orgeat that doesn't have to be overly sweet. Same thing with something called falernum. And those with, a very reasonable amount of pineapple juice or orange juice can be not terrible. But, really, it is a challenge because tiki drinks are the fruit juice, they can just be so sweet no matter what you try to do, other than using some of the non-alcoholic boozahols. But, I think that everybody should just go have a Mai Tai as long as they, are drinking. And,
imbibe responsibly.
Yeah, very responsibly. Because, at this particular time in my life, I'm intentionally leaving the door to the liquor cabinet locked. Because, like every time I read the news, I'm like, well, I could have a drink. And I was like, that is when you are least likely to need one. So
you put the key inside of a
gave
locked
it to the
safe
cat.
that you have to remember to go get the key. Yeah, I
You know, I
believe
mean,
that.
I have two cats named Mai Tai and Daiquiri, so I have the odds stacked against me.
Well, Chris, this has been delightful. You, as always, I am always thrilled to have 3 or 4 or 6 rounds of tiki drinks with you and to talk about such things. The fact that we did it today without a drop of alcohol, I think, just goes to how much we're both maturing. Frankly,
Did
I
we?
think.
Yeah. I'm having
But this
some Friday, so I'm being good. This is just water. Super boring right now.
Yeah. Yes, I'm into some black cherry seltzer today. So
Ooh,
that's the
bubbles.
strong stuff. Yes. Yeah, anyway, this has been wonderful. I am so glad you decided to come on with us and discuss this. I know that, so much of the strength of our industry comes from the effort of you and your team and the folks around that. And I know how much you have focused your attention on the growth of our industry and the stability of the ability to bring comics to comic shops. I think that's, I personally think it's a life well spent. So I'm thrilled to see what happens next, and I can't wait
36
to tell you.
years in, I'm ready to do it for another 26. So I have to find a place that wants me to do that with them. And I'm confident something will come up,
As a
and in the meantime, I get to play with comic fans and retailers at the CBLDF, and that's getting me by for right now.
Any ask of our audience? How do we find you? Tell us where Chris Powell is and what we should be doing with our time.
I think that you can always check out my incredibly boring social media. It's under Kahuna CP everywhere. My Instagram is pictures of my cats, cocktails, and wherever I am going this week. But as I dive into more and fun, exciting comic things, they'll be posted there. And in the meantime, I just think everybody needs to keep the faith, keep buying comics. People like you and Brian and the folks at Midtown, everybody who's working on software solutions. I have some ideas, so holler at me. And, I think that we can together get through this. And like the crash of the 90s, there is like another really good period ahead of us, but we've got to get there.
Amen to that. Thank you, Chris. And thank all of you. Once again, you've been watching Comic Industry Insiders Live, our weekly opportunity to talk about what's happening in the comic book industry. And having Chris on, I hope is not the last time, but I want to thank you for making it the first. Thanks, y'all. Namaste, y'all. We'll talk soon.